thank you for joining us for Archive Dive. I'm Catherine Austin, and I'm the curator for the Texas Archive of the Moving Image, or TAMI, a nonprofit based in Austin, Texas. Over the last 13 years, our organization has partnered with the Office of the Governor's Texas Film Commission to bring old films and videotapes back to life. Our Texas Film Roundup program not only provides Texans with free digitization services for their films and videotapes, but also preserves and shares their uniquely Texas stories via our website, texasarchive.org. There you can watch more than 5,000 videos contributed by individuals and institutions from across the state. Archive Dive highlights the people behind the collections on view at texasarchive.org. With support from Humanities Texas, we will chat with contributors about their materials and discover more information about those videos and the Texans who made them. Tonight, we are watching footage featuring Texas icon Liz Carpenter. Carpenter started working as a reporter in 1942, covering the White House and Congress for newspapers such as the Austin American Statesman. She formed the Carpenter News Bureau with her husband Les 3 years later. In 1960, she joined the staff of then vice presidential candidate Lyndon B. Johnson. And in the White House, Carpenter served as executive assistant to the vice president and press secretary to the first lady. She was the first woman to hold either position. Following the Johnson administration, Carpenter grew increasingly involved in the women's movement. She was a charter member of the National Women's Political Caucus and national co-chair of ER America. Liz Carpenter's daughter, Christy Carpenter, is currently working on a book highlighting both her mother's work and career alongside LBJ and Lady Bird Johnson, as well as the significant contributions of her father and the model political partnership they lived. We have Christy with us via video call. Good evening, Christy.
Good evening. Yes, and I want to add that I'm actively engaged also in creating a documentary about my mother.
Wow.
So the video is of particular interest. I'm working with an award-winning documentarian named Abby Ginsberg, and the two of us are co-producing this film. So.
Well, I definitely want to hear more about that. But thank you so much for joining us. And as a heads up, if anyone from the audience has questions for Christy during our conversation, Team TAMI is monitoring the comments section. But before we start tonight's program, Christy, several of the films we're about to watch came from materials that you shared with TAMI for the Texas Film Roundup. What can you tell us about the Carpenter collection?
Well, I started a few years ago going through lots of boxes that I had inherited from my mom, who died, I guess it's in 2009, excuse me, or 2010 rather. I'm so sorry, 2010. So I got inherited a whole bunch of boxes. Now, in addition, she had been giving since 1977 in different tranches materials to the LBJ library. So I started a few years ago, pre-COVID, to go down to the LBJ library and comb through these boxes and found all kinds of treasures in terms of documents and mementos and so forth, but also found all kinds of videotapes, some of which were not terribly well marked, and so I got some help from the audiovisual curators at the library, and then they turned me on to TAMI, which was fabulous because TAMI has been a wonderful partner in helping me get access, really visual access to some of these materials. So they include all kinds of things, and I know you've got a sampling tonight, but some of it was more personal kinds of things, and then a lot of it were news, represented news coverage and interviews and other kinds of things that my mother did in a more professional capacity. But anyway, lots of it was, there were a lot of, interesting and surprising things that came out of it.
You mentioned you're making a documentary. What is the scope of the documentary going to be about?
Well, the documentary is really going to be about some of the things we'll touch on tonight, which is my mother's life and career, emphasis on the career part, and her beginnings as a newspaper journalist, and then she segued, as we'll talk about, to working directly for first Lyndon Johnson as vice president, and then for staff director and press secretary for Lady Bird after that. But then she had a long life and career after the White House, writing. She ended up writing 5 books, and she wrote newspaper articles. She had a newspaper column. She had wrote lots of magazine articles. And she was very, very active in the women's movement. So that'll be an important component. The women's movement chapter in terms of the documentary will be a very important part of the film, because so many of those issues are still alive and with us today.
Prolific career for sure. But we're going to start this evening's program by looking back at Liz Carpenter's early career as a national political reporter. Let's roll the clip.
You also covered the Congress.
I did.
Sam Rayburn.
Yes, Mr. Rayburn, and Lyndon Johnson was, for a period of that time, the Senate Majority Leader. So those two giants, Sam Rayburn of Bonham and Lyndon Johnson of Johnson City, were just running the conference, although Eisenhower was president. But Johnson knew that and there was a very sharply divided Senate in 1952 through 56. And Johnson once told me that when Dick Russell, a senator from Georgia and a Tower, and Bob Taft, a Republican from Ohio, gave him their word, he knew that was 56 votes. And so when he could get that combination, he could make legislation move.
How did you cover the Congress, or did you cover just the Texas delegation?
Well, primarily Texas and the Southwest, Arkansas and Oklahoma, because I represented the Arkansas Gazette and the Tulsa Tribune. And by this time, I'd had 2 babies, and my husband was a newsman, and it was the happiest of worlds for us. And you sat on in the press gallery, and you made copious notes, and then you had great entrance with your press pass. You went down to the floor and called off the congressman, and they may be towering chairman, and then there were 6 chairmen from Texas, and at one point 4 out of 8 from Arkansas, Wilbur Mills and Orrin Harris and Bill Fulbright and John McClellan, Bob Kerr from Oklahoma. You could call them off the floor and ask them why they voted a certain way or what they were going to do next. It was more trying to translate the Congress to the country than to act as critic.
So that segment comes from a 1991 C-SPAN profile of Liz Carpenter. And I guess the best place to start, Christy, is how did your mother get into journalism?
Well, my mother grew up in a boisterous family in Austin, Texas. It was the Depression, and she had 4 siblings, and there was lots of conversation about politics around the table, always. And of course, FDR to them was God, as he was to so many people. And so she just had that natural instinct to want to be involved in whatever was going on. So she worked on the high school newspaper at Austin High, and so did my dad, and that's when they first met. And so when she went to the University of Texas, as did my father, they both were very interested in becoming journalists. They were just curious people who were very interested in politics and the world, and really wanted to be at the center of the action. So that was the driving force. And as soon as my mother got her degree in 1942, she got money for a ticket to Washington, and from an aunt who also paid for her, some appropriate outfits to wear, and went to Washington and pounded the corridors of the National Press Building and to get a job as a journalist. And it was wartime, and many men were off serving. And my father actually had to go serve in the Navy, so he wasn't in Washington at this point. She got hired pretty quickly, and initially for a small Michigan newspaper bureau, but she moved on from place to place to place with different jobs as a reporter. But she, right from the beginning, got a press pass, and that was just very exciting to her. And that gave her the entree to go and attend a few of FDR's press conferences, which he held, believe it or not, in the Oval Office. And she would talk about how she would and just gather the reporters around his desk. And she described how when she went, she was a junior reporter, so she was kind of in the back part of the room, but she'd stand on her tippy toes, and she could just see his cigarette holder bobbing up and down. And then Eleanor was the first lady to hold her own press conferences, because she was so active as a first lady, and she would invite women, and she said only women reporters can come. So that was great, because it forced a lot of newspapers to have to hire women.
To hire one, yeah.
And so she would invite them, and she would to the White House, and she would serve tea. Believe it or not, if you imagine the first lady sitting there serving tea, and the women who were dressed like women were at that time, lots wearing hats and wearing white gloves. And they would sit there and they would talk to Eleanor and ask her questions about what she was doing. So this was my mother's kickoff into life and cover as a journalist covering Washington. You know, she was only 22, so it was a big deal.
Talk about jumping into the deep end.
Yes, so that's how she got her start.
Well, it sounds like then that politics was always sort of the beat in journalism that she was interested in. You know, she wasn't really interested in.
Yes, I mean politics and public policy. I mean, not everything is a political act. A lot of it is really changing the law and doing things that are significant for one reason or another. So she covered in addition to Congress and the White House, I mean, she covered the federal agencies that were doing things that were significant to the areas for which she had newspaper readers, whether she was covering for the Tulsa Tribune or the Houston Post or whoever it was. It was regulatory acts that were of consequence that she would cover as well. So it wasn't always juicy politics.
Right. It wasn't always horse game kind of stuff. But then so your dad comes back from the Navy and they get married in 1944, I believe.
That's right.
And then soon thereafter, they start the Carpenter News Bureau.
Yes.
They started their own operation. Like, how did that work?
Well, yeah, and they didn't start it quite as quickly as you would.
Okay.
I mean, it was, there was a little more time. They each worked in their respective jobs as journalists. And then it was, I think, close to 1950 when they actually started the Carpenter News Bureau. And they started off with just a few newspapers, the Arkansas Gazette and a few others, and then built it from there, so that over time they were covering, well more than a dozen newspapers, and they were primarily in the Southwest, but over time again, it included newspapers, the Boston Herald Traveler, the Honolulu Advertiser. They were the Washington representatives for Variety, for the show business newspaper. Wow. So it was a diverse kind of thing. But these newspapers they didn't have the money to be able to have their own office in Washington with their own reporter or reporters. So having a news bureau who would do that for them, that was also serving other newspapers, was the cost-effective way to do it.
Was it just your parents doing the reporting, or did they have a staff at the bureau?
Well, initially it was the two of them, but they expanded, and they had at any given time, usually 3, maybe 4 different journalists who worked under them as journalists, but they were all out on the beat, collecting news.
Well, that's right. Well, our next film highlights Liz Carpenter's transition to a career in politics. The silent news footage from the Gordon Wilkinson collection shows her traveling with Lady Bird Johnson and others during what you think is likely LBJ's 1960 election campaign. Let's roll the clip. And since it is silent, we can even talk over. I love your mother's little beret that she's wearing in this footage. She looks adorable.
Yeah.
But your mother covered Lyndon B. Johnson's congressional career for years, obviously, as a reporter. Did she have much of a relationship with either of the Johnsons before joining his campaign staff?
Well, yes, by virtue of covering Lyndon Johnson's activities, but in the House, and then as he moved to the Senate. And when my mother first arrived in Washington, one of the first things she did was go to the office of her congressman, who was Lyndon Johnson. He was off at that moment in the Pacific, doing some Navy service, and so the person running that office was Lady Bird Johnson. So Lady Bird was one of the first people my mother met in Washington, and she was in that office all the time. Here you see them boarding the Lady Bird special. Lady Bird was the first first lady ever to campaign on her own, but in this instance, I think she's the wife of the she's the wife of the vice presidential candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And again, because she was seasoned, she'd been married to him for, since the 1930s, and she'd been involved in every one of LBJ's campaigns. And so she was a seasoned campaigner. And so there they were, boarding the Lady Bird special as the plane was painted, and out on the campaign trail.
I think it's a horse race, for one thing.
And we had a comment from someone watching ask, do you know if your mother had much of a relationship with UPI's Helen Thomas?
Oh, absolutely. When my mother, back in 1942, Helen Thomas arrived in Washington at the same time with the same ambitions to be a journalist. And they became friends. Helen told me, and Washington was wild in the time of the war, and there weren't enough places for people to live, so everybody's kind of living on top of each other. Mm-hmm. My mother lived in an apartment with a group of young women, and Helen Thomas told me one time about one time in that apartment when they threw a party. And there was so little space to do anything that she and my mother made salad in the bathtub. Served to the guests. So yes, they went a long way back and remained close friends over the course of their careers.
Oh, that's well, and it's also, it's interesting hearing about, how dedicated your mother was to journalism. She's starting this operation with your father, with the Carpenter News Bureau. Like, do you know what compelled her to make the switch to politics?
Well, it was the Johnsons that
Yeah.
Anyway,
they were very convincing.
right after the Democratic convention in 1960 in Los Angeles, actually, we were on a cross-country trip as a family which was built around going first to the Democratic convention in LA, going to national parks, and then on the way back going to the Republican convention in Chicago. And I think it may have been in Chicago. So that's a couple of weeks maybe after the Democratic convention, she gets a call from both Lyndon and Lady Bird together saying, do you want to join the great adventure of our lives? And so she was invited to go out to be the press secretary and spokesperson for Lady Bird. And then she also would travel with LBJ because Lady Bird would go out and campaign with him as well. Mm-hmm. So she was out on the campaign trail. So that was the first compelling entreaty from the Johnsons. And then right after the election, my mother went back to the Carpenter News Bureau to resume her career as a journalist. That's what she had expected to do. Mm-hmm. And early the following year, she got a phone call from LBJ inviting her to become part of his vice presidential staff. A space had just opened up because Bill Moyers left his staff to go over and work for Sarge Shriver at the Peace Corps. And so I asked my mother to join. And that was just needless to say, a very tempting career opportunity. So she jumped at it. And she became at that point the highest ranking woman that had ever been on a vice president's staff. And she traveled with him all over the world and did a mixed array of things for him, from dealing with some press issues to writing speeches, to special projects of all kinds. So it was the kind of she had fortunately had the flexibility and the can-do spirit to meld herself into the LBJ world.
Yeah, there has to be quite a change from being based in Washington to them being all over the country all the time. But really sort of just doing, looking at stories that she was doing so much as a reporter, but just from the opposite side. It seems like a very natural transition too.
Well, she had the sensibilities from her years as a journalist to know how to serve him well. And it just had, he was, as a lot of vice presidents do get asked to do, doing a lot of international traveling. So she was on those, it was not just domestic. She was traveling all over the world, from Asia to Africa to India to, Scandinavia. I remember that trip. She came back with a beautiful Norwegian sweater for me, which I used for years because it was the warmest sweater I've ever owned.
Believe it.
Those Norwegians know how to make sweaters. So, so anyway, it was an exciting time. And then she was with him as a staff person on that fateful trip to Dallas in 1963. Was in the motorcade, and then was on the Air Force One going back to Washington with him, and wrote the remarks that he gave when he landed his first message to a world audience after the assassination. So. And then from that point on, she, of course, was asked to be on the White House staff. So that was the next step.
Yeah. I want to say, as Executive Secretary to Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson and then Press Secretary to First Lady Lady Bird Johnson, Liz Carpenter became a public relations expert. She imparts some wisdom on the subject in our next segment. Let's roll the clip.
Okay.
What is politics showing people? What is it about politics that engages people? Can you talk about that?
Well, I think it's a horse race, for one thing. It's a gambler's game. It's high risk. That is one thing that holds you. But yes, let's assume that there are a lot of people who do care who runs their government. And I think that has a lot to do with it. I think that it's an ever-changing scene. I would never vote for Pat Buchanan, but he's amusing to hear. His language is colorful. I like Jesse Jackson. His language is colorful. Too many politicians today are turning people off by using, really dull language out of the textbooks, talking about structure and inner structure and infrastructure. I don't even know what those words are, but you need a good speaker, and I think a good speaker can be a rallying point for a cause, a commitment, a candidate.
What does a good speaker do to the people who are listening?
Gets inside their skin, puts some passion in, makes them laugh or cry. Laughter in politics is really important. I think we have too little of it now because people don't take the time to tell a story as a Jimmy Carter did, or as LBJ was a wonderful storyteller. We went for a period to the fast quip, Kennedy quip that fit a 30-second soundbite, or Ronald Reagan was a good master of fast retort, and he looked good-humored.
So that footage comes from Tammy contributor Paul Steckler, who conducted the interview for his 1996 television special, Vote for Me, Politics in America. And earlier tonight in that C-SPAN interview, we heard your mother describe her job as a reporter as, quote, trying to translate Congress to the country. So how do you think she would describe her roles in the White House?
Well, she would, I think the shorthand way she often would describe it was helping her, helping him, which meant helping Lady Bird and managing her activities in a way that would support the president's agenda. So that's kind of the shorthand. But I think, her role was so much more because she did know LBJ so well and have strong relationship with him, having covered him for 2 decades and then served directly on his staff for several years. He involved her in more than just Lady Bird, the kind of activities Lady Bird was involved in. And so her role spanned the West Wing as well as the East Wing a lot of times. She was the ultimate can-do woman, jack of all trades, and who had the confidence of both the president and the first lady. And that elevated her influence, I think, way beyond what any staff director to a first lady typically has.
Definitely. And with this segment, too, we also hear her talk about the importance of laughter in politics. And Liz Carpenter was certainly known for her wit and humor. How do you think she incorporated them both into her political communications?
Yes, well, my mother was a true wit, and she had a natural instinct for comedic timing when speaking. And, so people and organizations would often seek her out as a speaker, both, during her time in the White House, actually, as well as the rest of her life, really effectively. She would incorporate politics by using in her speech lots of topical humor, topical quips. And during the White House years, LBJ, who wasn't the world's greatest speaker, as we know, extremely effective in private settings, but not so great on the stump, because he was very serious and had a kind of ponderous style of speaking. But he actually had a very good sense of humor. But he would hand a speech to somebody in the West Wing, one of the speaker makers, and say, "Give this to Liz to sex it up." And what he meant by sex it up was, find a way to work in some humor. So she would do that for him. And other politicians would end up, because her reputation became such, that other politicians would call on her, like politicians who were speaking at the famous Gridiron, the Washington annual gathering of the major journalism figures, which is all about funny speeches, delivered both by the president and other members of the, other people in Congress and so forth, and funny things sometimes from reporters as well. And she'd be called on by a Hubert Humphrey or somebody else to write some jokes for his speech. So she would do that behind the scenes. But she really felt humor was vital, not just in politics, but in every aspect of life. So she was always, creating fun and crazy activities for all her friends. They created she created a Bay at the Moon group, where once a month she and a bunch of friends would get together and drink a lot and sing songs. They all had good voices except my mother, but she loved to sing. And they would Bay at the Moon and sing songs. And so, and after the White House, she, as I mentioned, and after leaving Washington, she would be called on to speak to all kinds of organizations. So that was a big part of her life.
And I don't know if it's in this interview or the C-SPAN interview where she talks about that she even formed like a humor writers group.
Yes,
for speech writing.
That was in the White House when, because he kept demanding humor for his speeches. And so she pulled together some other people in the White House who had some wit. And she had a liquor cabinet in her office. And so after, kind of very late in the day or early in the evening, she'd call them over and they would, have a drink, and she'd have her, she'd be sitting out with her typewriter and spin out, and they would together spin out some jokes that could be used.
Love it. Just plying everyone with alcohol for jokes for including in speeches.
It loosened it up, and it was also her way of attracting them to her office.
Sure.
Promise of a cocktail.
Well, that signature sense of humor is on full display in our next segment. This 1966 footage captures Liz and Les Carpenter's 22nd wedding anniversary party at the Georgetown Club in Washington, D.C. Let's roll the clip.
Well, hold up. Okay, go for it. Just before you do it, I'll say that I think to understand the humor in this segment, it's important to know that it was about a month before Lucy Johnson got married. and which was a very big deal in Washington. You know, it involved hundreds and hundreds of guests and movers and all the movers and shakers in Washington, and people were vying to get invitations. This was the big social event of the year. So
and a staff director and press secretary for Lady Bird, your mother had her hands in all those pots of like trying to organize that and it, being televised. And I will also plug that Tammy has like a government film that was made sort of documenting the wedding ceremony and how wild it was. So I encourage folks to look that up.
And she also had LBJ getting mad at her at various times.
I'm sure.
You know how weddings can be. So anyway.
No, that's great. That's a great ad. Let's roll the clip.
June the 17th, 1944 may well go down in history as a historic milestone because I think it's going to be the only wedding in history in which I was deeply involved and survived. I've been thinking all day of many of the current similarities between the situation of the whole world moving in on you and lots of telephones ringing. And I want you to know that only 40 of the guests asked for seats at the wedding tonight, Bob. Training on their part. But all weddings do have one boy, one girl, and one Monsignor. And there were, even though it was 22 years ago, great similarities between our own ceremony and the current one. For instance, there was the matter of television. Les and I considered it a very long time, and grappled with it, and finally we did decide against it in view of the number of requests. And then circumstances forced us to pool coverage. Us. The circumstances were the editor of a paper that we'd both done servitude on, real romantic, and I had worked for him during the war, and when I bade him farewell, got ready to get on the train and come to Washington to marry Les, he was faced with the manpower shortage of the war and losing the only $18 a week reporter he had. And he said, all right, if you want a story in this paper, you two can damn well write it. So we wrote our own story lengthily and glowingly, and it really stands in the annals of journalism as a great inspiration of managed wedding news.
And now you were among the guests there that evening. What do you remember about the celebration?
Well, I was 16 years old, and I brought my high school boyfriend with me. And it was a glamorous black tie affair at the Georgetown Club, one of the posh clubs in Washington, D.C. And so, I mean, I remember it being fun. It was, you see lots of laughs.
Mm-hmm. So there was it was that like former Eisenhower White House official Robert Gray hosted, and that the guests included 3 cabinet members, several members of Congress, journalists, and a Supreme Court justice.
Yes, well,
So
you've done your research. I didn't even remember all of those details. That's great.
But which I thought was just wild, and I was also so struck because it's a home movie technically, but it's like she was inspired by the sort of television coverage of the Johnson wedding that she'd just been a part of, that it was like, was it being like simulcast somewhere? It was like a television feed. Did I get that wrong?
Oh no, I don't think this was a television feed.
No, because there was something in my research and looking it up where I figured out all of these guests that were there, that it was of like the cameras that were being used. Like it wasn't, just like, it's not on like 8mm film or something. It was like this very specific camera.
It was on some obscure format, which fortunately you guys found some place that that I could pay to get it, put onto, made digital, basically digitized. So I was really grateful for your help there. Yes, I don't know that it was ever broadcast anywhere.
I want to say that it was like broadcast at the event. It was like there was there was like a screen at the event that was playing it. Maybe I'm remembering that wrong.
That could be.
Yeah. No. I think like it should be seen on television. So I'm glad we have it now on our website where other people can see it and get your mother's great humor. But and we've talked so much about your mother tonight, but I'd love to hear more about your father.
Sure.
So what was his role at the Carpenter News Bureau?
Well, my dad, I should say my mother and my father were totally equal partners,
Mm-hmm.
professionally, personally, in an era when that was extremely rare. He had grown up in Austin, Texas, too, and had the same kind of ambitions that she did. So they were natural partners, and he he was a great guy. He loved parties, which was fortunate because my mother also was a social animal, and they were very gregarious, and they were very popular on the party circuit. And Washington was in those days a very social town, and people, Republicans, Democrats, everybody mixed. The it was not, the atmosphere was completely different from the way it is today. And so he continued after she went, started to the other side of the pad and pencil and started working for the Johnsons. He maintained the news bureau, of course, and continued doing what he had been doing, and had a small staff of reporters, and so he kept that going.
Right. Because I was wondering how your mom being in the White House might change what he is doing professionally.
Well, it didn't. I don't think it changed it much. I'd say that her prominence and visibility certainly didn't hurt him in terms of having access. I would say, he was already kind of a known commodity around town, but in the quarters of power. But I think probably he got some of the afterglow of that might have helped him in his reporting work. She was very scrupulous, my mother, about because of course she was privy to things that were unfolding in the White House. She was very scrupulous never to violate the trust of news that had not been released to other journalists. And I know because I came across things in the papers that on occasion that pissed him off.
I was just going to ask, like, you let this other outlet judge me?
You didn't tell me that judge was going to be appointed. How did you tell me that? But she stuck to her scruples, is from what I could tell, from what I read.
Oh, that's great. You can't get much better access than living in the same house. But
yes.
But and Elizabeth is telling me that footage was on 2-inch video, which is normally a broadcast format. Which is why we don't usually work with that very much. Is why we had to outsource it.
Well, it could be that Bob Gray, being a PR man, who gave the party, might have turned it over to the local stations, and maybe some of it got picked up. I don't know. I have no memory of that.
Obviously, like she says herself that no one was going to write about their nuptials, so they wrote their own to be published, and it was like they sort of created their own television coverage of their wedding anniversary. But
I think that was Bob Gray's doing. I don't think it was. But anyway, yes.
But we get a glimpse of your family's home life with our next segment. This 1952 home movie captures you and your brother Scott opening presents with your mother on Christmas morning. Let's roll the clip.
There I am.
And that's you. And there's your mom.
That's my mom. I think I'm 1 year old. I was born on December 15th, so I think I'm one years old. That's my brother. There I go. And my brother is going to be putting on his gift with some cowboy boots. I don't know. This is another child who was there. That's so.
No, I love that your brother gets cowboy boots. Because it makes me, it's like, because you were born in Washington, D.C., weren't you?
We were both born in
Washington, D.C. So what was it like growing up in D.C.?
Well, it was an exciting place to grow up, particularly as a child of people who were involved in what was happening politically and in public policy. And My parents, as I said, love to be at the center of things, and their enthusiasm for it was all very infectious and carried over to us. And my parents also took great pains to make sure we got to do special things by virtue of being in Washington and the fact that they had connections and access. So when the Mercury 7 astronauts came to the White House to meet John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson as vice president, and one of the Mercury 7 astronauts was named Scott Carpenter, my brother's name.
Right.
So my parents made sure that my brother got invited, and he got to go and meet these astronauts, which was
That's pretty
really
cool.
exciting. And then they made sure that we got to be part of the inaugural parades. So,
Oh, cool.
so in 1956 and 1960 and 64 and 68, we rode on different floats for different states, and we're part of that. So those are just examples of some of the things we got to do. In addition, of course, to attending political conventions, which we did, tagging along with our parents. I mean, not in the small children phase, but as soon as we were of age. My first one was in 1964 in Atlantic City, the Democratic Convention. So those were all great benefits of being the child of Washington journalists.
Some connected people, yeah. But then, so you're born and growing up in Washington, D.C. Your mother is traveling around the country, around the globe, but your brother's still getting cowboy boots for Christmas. So was Texas still very much a part of your family's life and roots?
Well, it was certainly part of the roots, and
yes.
And my mother would talk often about our ancestors, who she was a fifth generation Texan on both her mother's side and her father's side, and those three generation great grandfathers for me, second for her, were some of the earliest settlers in Texas. Came in 1930 in one case, and 1830 and 1832, and they each brought settlers with them because they were leaders. My three great grandfather Sterling Robertson, who was one of the impresarios in Texas and got a big land grant from the Mexican government, brought 600 families from Nashville, Tennessee. And then my three great grandfather George Sutherland brought a whole clan of Sutherlands and Rogers and others, all Scottish heritage, through Alabama into Texas and settled a little further south in the state. But I'm descended directly from three men who signed the Texas Declaration of Independence, and one of my three great uncles was George Childress, actually wrote it. The Texas Declaration of Independence. So my parents were my mother particularly was, of course, it was her family. So she was very proud of all this. And so we were indoctrinated with a lot of Texas things. And we'd come to Texas, we'd visit Texas to see relatives, because really all our relatives were in Texas. But Scott and I were really Washington kids who got a taste of Texas.
Well, that's great. Well, I would imagine too, with LBJ and Lady Bird in the White House, that sort of Texas and sort of like Texas culture was already a bigger part of the sort of Washington scene than maybe it had been in previous years.
Yes. And going back before that, as my mother was saying in that clip from the C-SPAN interview, Texans. Well, first of all, Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn, but there were many Texans that were head of congressional committees, and so. The Texas community was of members of Congress and their families and lobbyists and others. It was a very tight-knit community of Texans in Washington that I grew up in. I knew lots of the children of all these people.
When going back to this Christmas home movie footage, this is one of the the few home movies that we have in your family's collection. Was your family making home movies often?
Not really.
Too busy.
And that had to have been made by somebody else. I don't think we ever had a home movie camera, so I think that was, that was probably somebody else who did that. And the other one I have that I'm not sure if it's part of your collection yet, could be, if you want it, was my grandfather, who actually, as a profession, ran a motion picture camera at the Varsity Theater on the Drag in Austin. That was his career, and he was
we don't have that yet, Christy, and I'm putting it right now that we would love to have that.
Okay, well, he was a union officer, and he came to Washington for a big union conference, and he took home movies of us. It was cherry blossom time, so we were down at the Tidal Basin around the Jefferson Memorial, and he took home movies that captured that.
Oh, that's beautiful. A classic Washington scene. But we have talked about your mother's contributions to journalism and politics, but she was also a feminist with deep ties to the women's movement. And in our next video, shared by Tammy contributor Keller Barron, she appears alongside First Lady Rosalind Carter and Betty Friedan to rally support for the Equal Rights Amendment. Let's roll the clip.
The men are basically designed to lead. The women are designed as a help to the man.
Outside the convention hall, people demonstrated against the Equal Rights Amendment. ERA was one of the most emotional and hotly debated issues we faced. Here, in a meeting sponsored by ER America, we heard from those in favor of it, including First Lady Rosalind Carter.
In my view, our message from Houston to the women of our country must be short and simple. We should say to those who are wavering, to those who are ill-informed, to those who are confused because of shrill voices, we should say to them that when you think of the Equal Rights Amendment, think about yourself. Equal legal protection, equal legal opportunities are the basis of our democracy and of our quality of life. These rights are long overdue. Thank you very much.
Next, we heard from Betty Friedan.
My daughter said to me this summer, I'm not a feminist, I'm a person. And I said, well, good. But then I thought about it and I felt some pain and I felt some worry. And in these 16 cities, I've been talking to daughters like that, in the law schools, getting the MBAs, in the medical school, that's where my daughter is. And I said, look, you think you're here because of your exceptional ability? You think you're here because of the largesse of IBM or of the medical school? You are here because we fought 15 years for equality. And now it's time for you to pay your dues.
So that footage comes from a 1978 television special about the National Women's Conference, which was the first and as yet only federally funded women's conference that was held in Houston in November 1977. And what was your mother's involvement with the conference?
Yeah, well, it was generated by Bella Abzug in Congress and with cooperation from the White House and Jimmy Carter, because it was International Women's Year. Mm-hmm. And the United States needed to have an activity, needed to do something to showcase women and their importance in America. And so my mother was appointed first by Gerald Ford and then reappointed by Carter to be on the commission, the American Commission for International Women's Year. So she was a commissioner along with Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem and met Maya Angelou. I mean, a wide spectrum of prominent women in America. And the goal of the conference was to develop recommendations for a national agenda for women. And it was a very big deal. No such gathering of women with such a mission had ever occurred and been funded by the U.S. government, as you mentioned. And my mother was front and center during this historic conference because she was a commissioner. Also, she was a well-known feminist, and she was drafted to give one of the opening speeches at the conference, and which I found found a copy of in these
great.
boxes that I've combed through. And according to all the people that I've talked to that were there, and some of the news coverage of it, she had everybody on their feet, hooping and hollering and laughing during her remarks. So she played a big role, and she also staged, with the help of other people, a fundraising event for ERA America.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think that may be where that clip comes from. And the same, is not officially part of the conference, but just off-site, taking advantage of all of the women that had from around the country congregated in Houston. And she was co-chair of ERA America. So she played a very prominent role with regard to having all these first ladies. I mean, just imagine, all these first ladies endorsing together the ERA. I mean, it was quite something.
And she was involved with the conference, and then she was pretty involved with just the wider women's movement too.
Absolutely. I mean, she was one of the co-founders of the National Women's Political Caucus that had been founded earlier in the early 1970s, and she was out around the country campaigning for various women, for galvanizing women to be part of the caucus, to form state caucuses that could support and nurture candidates, to get more women to run for office. So she was very active with that as well. So over several decades, my mother was involved in leadership roles in what is called the second wave of the women's movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, and she also joined 2 more White Houses after LBJ, first as Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs under Jimmy Carter, and then as a member of the White House Conference on Aging under President Bill Clinton. But after returning to Austin in 1976, she also pursued a literary career as a writer and humorist, as we've talked about before. And our next segment shows her talking turkey with Cactus Pryor and John Henry Falk. Let's roll the clip.
Good.
Though, thinking of today, I've been working on a story, a magazine piece about peace. And how do you cover peace? Peace isn't hard news. I can almost look out, and if I could see 50 miles and put a compass around this town, and I have interviewed and talked to about 50 people in the last 24 hours who are involved in peace one way or another. Molly Doherty, raising money for a hospital in El Salvador. Fred Ward heading something called the Friendship Forum, rallying people to stay in homes and know people as friends and to have them in their homes here. I just am amazed, and I really think it says something, not just about Austin, but about our times, and the fact that we are in tune and maybe a little bit ahead of pushing for, hopefully, a span of peace.
I think that a lot of people from outside of Austin and Texas look at Austin and they see us as being somehow kind of this hippie, new age,
guitar-playing town.
And lost in the fog. And then I'd talk to people who are really concerned about global issues like the environment and things like that, who think of Austin as being so far out ahead of a lot of other people.
Oh, it certainly was in the women's movement. When I was up there with all those noisy women like Bella Abzug and all of them, and we were pushing women to run for public office, by gosh, in Texas, we elected more than they did in New York State. And I thought it showed kind of an old Texas attitude that women were part of the frontier. Nobody looked at, asked who had to carry the rifle or go get the water. And it was, it shows in people like Ann Richards and Sarah Weddington.
That footage comes from a 1989 episode of the KLRU call-in show Austin at Issue, which was shared with Tammy by contributors Cactus and Peggy Davis Pryor. And just seeing them together, like, I'm imagining your family's home in Washington, D.C., and then later your mother's house in Austin as just like hosting a who's who of Texas legends on a regular basis. Would you say that's an accurate assumption?
Yes, I'd say that's absolutely accurate. And my mother's party giving impulses went on from Washington to Texas, and she loved to throw parties, and she'd bring together all kinds of people. There was usually singing involved, especially Methodist hymns, which she had grown up with and was particularly crazy about. And so yes, and and she loved getting together with her feminist friends and cooking up trouble, stirring things up. So anyway, yeah.
Well, we have a great question from Katie Kelly asking, what do you think Liz would think about social media as a news source for today's younger generation?
Oh boy, I think she'd be
a big
worried.
Question. Yeah.
I think she'd be really worried about it. I mean, the nature of it is a lot of it, not all of it, obviously, but a lot of it is so negative, and people feel a license when they're on the internet to just say anything, no matter how mean, how awful, how untrue. It's not been a force for cohesiveness in our country, and my mom wouldn't like that. And she also was such a people person. She would have wanted people to be together physically. That's where you should exchange ideas and make things happen. Would be to be physically together. So I think she would have had a very hard time adjusting to this new world.
Well, I think you saying that she would have wanted people to be together is the perfect segue, Christy, to our final clip, which is, is from one of the lectureships that she sponsored at the University of Texas. She was a distinguished alumna of the University of Texas at Austin, and she started a lectureship series, and we have a segment for one next. Let's roll the clip.
Okay.
I love this university. Lady Bird has always said it opened the windows of the worlds for me, and for me too, because I graduated here in 1942 and took my journalism degree and my virtue intact and went to Washington. I still have the journalism degree. But as a reporter covering Washington, one of my papers was the Arkansas Gazette, and soon I became aware of a young Senate staffer who came to work for Senator J. William Fulbright. And the student was an enthusiastic kid from Hope, Arkansas, swept up by all the excitement of public service. Alas, though, he failed his first assignment. It was to drive Senator Fulbright and get him to the right speech at the right time. And he kept plying the senator with questions about the world and politics and kept getting lost and being late, a habit that has continued throughout his career. As Arkansas's Attorney General, Governor, President, and now former President and senatorial spouse.
So that was Liz Carpenter introducing former President Bill Clinton to deliver the 2003 Liz Carpenter Lectureship held at the Frank Erwin Center. What inspired your mother to start the Liz Carpenter Lectureship at UT? And it's still going on.
Is it? Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's still going on. We had the historian Jill Lepore just a few weeks ago talking and giving the lecture. She didn't create it.
Okay.
A group of her, it was the sesquicentennial year, and I can't do the math in my head at the moment, but I think it was in the 1980s. And the university was inviting donors to create chairs, professorships, and lectureships and other things. And a group of my mother's friends got together and said there should be a Liz Carpenter lectureship. And so a lot of people donated money. A lot of her friends in Washington, as well as her Texas friends, and created an endowment. And she was very active with it when she was alive, and doing things like recruiting Bill Clinton, not just once.
Yeah, twice. Once while he's president.
Yeah, well, and then again while he's president. Only my mother had the moxie to press him to do that, but like a lot of people, my mother asked and he fell in line.
Yeah, she had quite the Rolodex.
She had a knack for getting people to do things she wanted them to do. She also had Hillary when she was first lady, and Hillary gave one of her really more important speeches, which ended up being, a cover story in the New York Times Sunday magazine about that speech. So anyway, it goes on, and I've taken over the role in my mother's absence of working with the university to make sure we get really top-notch speakers.
Cool. Well, you're the perfect person to talk to about this thing, Christy. And I would say too that, as we're talking about, that the lectureship continues, and then just watching your family's collection and learning about your mother's professional contributions, you get the impression that giving back to Texas was really of great importance to her. And how do you see your mother's legacy?
Well, I think that she loved Texas, as we discussed, and she felt passionately about it, and felt passionately about making the world a more equal place with more opportunity. It makes the story. I start to get a little weak.
No, I'm sure.
With more opportunity for people, and for people, for people of all races and sexes, and so I see her legacy as being a change maker, as being somebody who really wanted to get the nation to live up to its founding ideals, and and she loved to inspire younger people. She always had lots of younger friends. One of her great lessons that I've tried to take on. So she'd be, if she were here, she'd still be stirring things up.
Yeah. I wish to hear what she would say in moments like these. She's a truly incredible person, and it's so interesting to watch footage of her. Which leads me to my last question to wrap up, Christy. What value do you see in preserving personal film and videotape collections like yours? There's obviously a historical value to news footage featuring your mother, with how connected she was and how central she was to Washington's going on, but especially like home movies and everything else.
Well, I'll just say in general first. I mean, what Tammy does is absolutely invaluable. But it's invaluable for everybody to be able to not only contribute things, but also to get the benefit of watching, because the wide variety, the depth of your collection, and the wide variety of things, the materials that you have that are available to the public, no charge, to take advantage of. It's just really important. And I think just, as to your question about home movies and that kind of thing, I think that those kinds of materials can be very illuminating in terms of how people lived at different times, and capturing what their homes and communities looked like. I know I've seen footage that you've had that showed downtown Austin at various stages in its existence, and they give us a snapshot of what life was like, and that is always useful to contrast with how things are today, to remind us where we came from.
And I think, with your mother's in particular, we have such a great record of her professional work, both in the White House and after it, but that's just one side of the person that she was. And other footage from sort of other sources, other kinds of film, can sort of reveal other elements of her personality and what was important to her.
Yes, and thank you for putting together. I mean, the clips you selected are really wonderful ones, and and you've done such a great job doing your research and your way you've presented it and come up with questions. So thank you, Catherine, for doing
thank you, Christy.
Wonderful work.
We're so grateful that you shared your collection with us and with our audience as a contributor to the Texas Film Roundup program. And it really was a special privilege to talk to you about your mother and her incredible legacy tonight. I cannot wait to see the documentary that you've been working on, because
Thank you.
Learn even more about her. And if anyone is interested in participating in the Texas Film Roundup, Team Tammy will be in San Angelo on October 22nd and 23rd to collect films and videotapes for free digitization. We are also accepting mail-in submissions throughout the month of October. Registration and additional details can be found at texasarchive.org/round-up. And if you enjoyed learning about these films, please consider sending us a tip. We take donations via texasarchive.org/support-us, or you can text Texas Archive to 44321. Archive Dive is made possible in part with a grant from Humanities Texas, the state affiliate for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Good night, everybody.